Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Next week, Reformed Jews will convene in San Diego, California for the 2013 URJ Biennial and the WRJ Assembly. The Biennial is the largest religious gathering in North America and brings together nearly 5,000 people from more than 500 congregations and 14 countries. There are lay leaders and professionals from Reformed congregations, youth, college students, congregants, new and future leaders, clergy, scholars, affiliates, vendors, entertainers, musicians, and more. The Biennial is an opportunity to explore, renew, and reimagine our Jewish lives, to be challenged and inspired to make Judaism relevant to our lives and the lives of our congregants and our children. It is a time and place to share our challenges and best practices in areas ranging from membership, youth engagement, adult education, engagement with Israel, social action, and worship. To study together and to learn from some of the best minds in the movement, to listen to the latest Jewish music, to shop or at least to window shop from some of the most interesting Judaica artists and booksellers, to dance and sing and pray together in a variety of styles, to reunite with old friends and to make new ones. If you're not one of the 25 Holy Blossom Temple members going to San Diego, you can join the virtual biennial experience. You can join biennial conversations on Twitter, #biennial13, or you can go to the URJ website's biennial page, which will live stream all plenary sessions and Shabbat services. The Biennial is also a time when delegates from Reformed congregations help to make policy by voting on proposed resolutions. Historically, the resolutions adopted by the URJ reflect the evolutionary changes in its official positions on many political, social, economic, and humanitarian issues. Since its inception in 1873, the URJ has not hesitated to speak out on issues of the widest scope and significance, always seeking to elucidate current problems according to its interpretation of the voice of prophetic Judaism. At this biennial, 4 resolutions will be voted on. A resolution in support of paid sick leave, a resolution on the United States' continuing embargo of Cuba, a resolution on hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, and a resolution on First Nations. The resolution on First Nations was submitted by the Social Action Committee of the CCRJ, the Canadian Council for Reformed Judaism. The current wording of the text, which is slightly different than the version on our website, may be found on the URJ Biennial website. The text may also be amended from the floor at the plenary, where it is presented and voted on. 20 members of Holy Blossom will be voting delegates at the biennial. The preamble to the resolution provides some background historical information on First Nations communities, their special and difficult relationship with the Canadian government, and the property, healthcare, social, and economic issues that challenge First Nations members. The preamble also highlights the lasting damage done to First Nations families and cultures as a result of the Canadian government's residential schools policy. The preamble remarks that as Jews, our history as victims of discrimination makes us particularly sensitive to the plight of the First Nations, especially the pain of being denied the opportunity to express our culture and faith, and the corresponding collective trauma that occurs and persists even over generations. It also states that we continue to bear the moral responsibility to shed light on injustice and stand with those working to right historic wrongs. In the current draft of the First Nations resolution, the Union for Reformed Judaism resolves, 1, to support efforts toward greater self-determination by Canada's First Nations communities. 2, to commend the Prime Minister and the Canadian government for their efforts to engage productively with the First Nations community, such as the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. 3, to call on the Government of Canada to abide by existing treaties and agreements, to create and implement a compulsory nationwide educational curriculum exploring the history of First Nations of Canada, including the government's involvement with the residential school system and other assimilationist efforts that negatively impacted the First Nations community. To support and help implement with full First Nations involvement the necessary physical and mental health, educational and housing systems to address existing shortcomings. To work with First Nations to mitigate environmental damage to First Nations land, and to ensure that no licenses are granted for the development or use of First Nations land without consultation with First Nations or without the creation of appropriate financial agreements and partnership structures. Finally, the URJ resolves to encourage our Canadian congregations to continue to develop and strengthen relationships with the First Nation community. It is this final resolution on which I would like to comment. As Jews, we know all too well what it feels like to be strangers and to be treated as strangers. We have endured a long history of otherness. In this week's Torah reading, after Jacob's entire family comes to Egypt so that they might reunite with Joseph, Joseph instructs his brothers to tell Pharaoh that they are shepherds, since all shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians. This allows them, in fact, to dwell apart from in their own region of Goshen. We are not told why shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians, merely that they are. And this is despite the fact that Pharaoh is pleased by Joseph's family reunion and has invited Joseph's family to live in Egypt. We know what will happen to the Israelites in the future when a Pharaoh arises who did not know Joseph. We'll begin to read about this in 2 weeks. It is out of our historical and communal experiences as strangers in the land of Egypt that God continually commands us, 36 separate times in the Torah, more than any other commandment, to treat the stranger with compassion and justice. We are instructed, do not wrong a stranger and do not oppress him. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Misraim, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do not oppress a stranger, for you know hanefesh, the feelings, the soul of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. When a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not wrong him. The stranger that resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. Ve'ahavta lo chamocha. You shall love the stranger as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. We are also instructed to leave for the strangers, in addition to the widow and orphan, the corners of our fields and what remains after the first harvest or gleaning of our fields, our olive trees, and our vineyards. And God says, and you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. The Torah challenges us not just to look after the stranger, but also to feel the stranger's pain and link it to our own experiences. Our tradition challenges us not to dislike or be suspicious of the stranger, but rather to recognize our shared humanity and the inherent dignity of all life. The prophet Malachi asks, "Have we not all one Father? Has not one God created us?" The Torah also teaches us, "Tzedek, tzedek tirdof," justice, justice shall you pursue. So many of us Jews and First Nations people are strangers to one another. How do we move from this place of strangeness and otherness? The URJ resolutions asks us to develop and strengthen relationships with the First Nations communities. Here's what's going on at Holy Blossom. Last month, the Honorable Bob Ray came to speak to us about the complexity of the issues facing First Nations communities. I think many of us came to that event ready and eager to define a course of action and to begin the pursuit of justice for First Nations issues. We had planned to hold roundtable discussions after his presentation to consider how we as a sacred community can and should respond to those issues. However, we discovered that this plan was premature, because what we learned from Mr. Ray was how diverse the First Nations peoples are in their languages, their cultures, their histories, their circumstances. And we learned how well-founded is their distrust of the words and professed good intentions of outsiders like us, claiming to want to help them. We were humbled by the extent of our ignorance of First Nations peoples and their communities. And we realized that our single most important next step must be to educate ourselves about the histories and the cultures of First Nations peoples. We also realized that if we are to break down the barriers of otherness, we need to get to know First Nations people by developing personal relationships. And it is beginning. Our 7th grade students are studying comparative religions right now. A First Nations leader recently spoke to them about her tribe's rituals and creation stories. Daniel Rohr, one of our congregants and a documentary filmmaker, traveled to the Inuit community of Resolute Bay for 6 weeks in October to begin his own process of getting to know one of Canada's major Aboriginal peoples. And if you look on your pew cards, you'll see that at the Brotherhood breakfast in the morning, a week from tomorrow, not in the evening as it indicates, but 9:30 in the morning, a week from tomorrow, Professor Lee Miracle, a member of the Stolo Nation from North Vancouver, who teaches at the University of Toronto and the University of Guelph, will share her wisdom on how to engage youth. And in late January, we will gather to discuss how we should start our education about and dialogues with First Nations communities. And I invite you to participate if you're interested. My prayer this morning is that we take the steps necessary to build deep and respectful relationships between members of our Holy Blossom community and members of First Nations communities. May we learn about one another, and may we learn from one another, so that we cease to be strangers to each other. Amen.